How do you remember somebody after they're gone? What do you do after the last part of them leaves? You left, but I never forgot you. Only 4 years later, the last part that I knew of you left also. Bonnie was more than a dog to me. For me, Bonnie was the last living part to Margaret Hutson. Margaret had a history, but she never really talked about it.
Margaret Hutson is the coach before the coach. Little known, but nearly as successful when you compare wins to losses.
You are very tenacious. I mean, you have found us, whereas some of them haven't. And even people around here have no idea that I had anything to do at the University of Tennessee.
Hutson coached the Lady Vols for 4 years, just before Pat Summitt arrived. In that time, her teams won 77% of their games.
But what was Margaret like?
I think Margaret's one of those people that you can tell when you ask someone, did you know Margaret Hutson? You can tell when you ask them by their facial expression how they knew Margaret and how well they knew Margaret, right? Because if you say, did you know Margaret Hutson, and they start to smile, then you know they knew Margaret like you knew Margaret. They knew her as somebody who loved to laugh, loved to joke, loved to pull a prank on somebody, who loved to tease. You know, they knew that Margaret. And if they didn't know that Margaret, then you don't necessarily get that reaction. Like if they knew Margaret the coach, or they knew Margaret as a coach, or Margaret was a professor, or Margaret was this or that, then they didn't know her on the level that we knew her.
Oh gosh, how would I describe Margaret Hutson? Holy moly. She was very detail oriented, almost to a point of being anal. She was so detail oriented. She had a great sense of humor. She always likes to tell me how I met her brother. She would always tell me stories about her brother Dean and how she played tricks on people, where she would get him to play. I think for Fred Self, he played a state trooper, so he came into the King Center and talked about, an issue with one of the college vehicles. So she was always telling me about Dean and how funny he was, and the little monkey faces that he would make. But she got me with Dean one day. We were moving into a new space in the King Center with the athletic training department. And Dean came in as one of the construction workers, I think, and at that point in time, he was talking about there was a piece of equipment that wouldn't fit, which didn't make sense at the time. But after he had me on the line for a while, Margaret just walks in the room laughing because she had got me. I had been struck by the Deanie Weenie, so he had got me. So, I think of Dean and Mary in the same way now. They're family. But she was very detail-oriented, great sense of humor. She was very smart, super smart. And such a caring, empathetic person. She was just a good lady. She was just a good human being.
Well, she had a great sense of humor, and we just did a lot of fun things. I mean, it was a great time to be together. And what I was telling you was the story about when we were having pizza together at the Trollinger's house, and Richard and I went to Abingdon to pick up the pizza at Bella's. And while we were gone, Patsy and Margaret, knowing that I didn't like all the lights on houses for Christmas, it was one of my pet peeves. My house was up on the hill behind theirs, and while we were gone, they got a string of lights and strung them all along the front of my house. So when we came back up the driveway, that was the first thing I saw, and I just knew what had happened, that Margaret and Patsy had done that, and they had. So, and they were so proud of themselves for doing that to me. Yeah, but you just never knew with Margaret what she would come up with.
Well, Margaret was headstrong in a good way. She was determined, she was hardworking, She had a sense of what she wanted to get accomplished, and she accomplished a lot of things in her life. You know, of course, everybody knows the famous story, even though she didn't like us to tell it, about her, you know, being the coach for the UT women's basketball team before she came to Emory and Henry. She made some important legacies there, including their uniforms and that sort of thing. So she, you know, she just did a lot of great things in her lifetime and in her career. And, you know, she never married, and I have never married. And so it's nice to have those other people like that in your life to sort of look up to and say, here's someone who's done just fine as a single woman in the world, single working woman in the world. So it was nice to have someone like Margaret to look up to.
She was a very caring person. And when she had a task to do, she always made it a point to do the best she could.
And the people that Margaret met, she had a special connection with.
Well, again, she was like a second mom to me, but she was a grandmother to my kids. I remember when we had our first kid. There's actually still pictures of her on our refrigerator where she was holding my son. With my daughter, things were already, I don't think Margaret would have ever remembered Riley at the time, Bryce 100%. But again, she was, those were her kids too. You know, Thanksgiving, for Halloween, we were one of the few that would go over there, and I think we were the ones that she would always wait on to make sure that we came. But again, I've got pictures all over my house of what she meant to us, and not only my kids, but my wife, Trudy. They were a hoot when they got together. They were always pranking on each other, and my wife has a very good sense of humor as well. So when you put her and Dr. Hutson together, or Margaret together, you better watch out because something was probably getting ready to happen, or you're going to have to listen to these Fruit Loops talk to each other and laugh and giggle. So it was a fun time.
However, something started to change in Margaret, and later on she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's.
Conversations didn't make as much sense, and they kind of went from, you know, I say this as I feel like I'm rambling here, but they kind of rambled, and they went from one thing to the next thing to the next, and it didn't make much sense. And she was, and she didn't find an ending place, or a, you know, she just wasn't as connected as you thought.
It wasn't out of nowhere. I actually had some conversations with some that were close with her. I remember specifically having a conversation with Joy Scruggs at the time, and she had brought up, you know, Margaret just wasn't, something was off in terms of not remembering stuff, and that was not Margaret. I mean, she was Johnny on the spot with everything, super detailed. So when you started to see some of the lapses, you didn't really know if it was just normal senior moments or if it was something much worse than that. But the incidence of her memory kind of lapsing on her really increased, so you knew that something was not right. So, but again, Joy was probably the first to notice, and then after that, it progressed relatively quickly. She got worse and worse in terms of, I mean, I was concerned at a point that she just could not live independently and take care of herself and her dog at the time, because you knew something wasn't right.
There's one moment that really let them know that there was something wrong.
She backed in her driveway in October of 2015. She normally backed into her garage so she could be headed out, and she pulled in forward, not thinking, and I'm sure that was part of the dementia. And so she started backing down the driveway. When she got to the end of the driveway, she didn't negotiate the turn on Elm Street. She went over the embankment and was stuck in a car with Bonnie for 13 hours. She had a cell phone, and she didn't think to call somebody. She didn't think to blow the horn because there were people around the car. several people around. Teresa Kessler lived next door, and then there was another lady lived on the other side of her, and the Morgans lived there. If she had blown the horn, somebody would have come to her, but she ended up staying in the car all night long. And finally, the next morning, she found her medic alert pendant that she wore around her neck, and she pressed that. And they called DC, your dad, and I think it was maybe Brianna went to check on Margaret, and sure they found her in the car. And fortunately, she wasn't hurt, but the car it took them about 3 months to get it repaired. I think it did about $10,000 worth of damage to the car. When I took her to, this happened before, when I took her to the neurologist in Bristol, he told her, he said, "No, you have dementia and you cannot drive anymore. It's just not going to be safe for you to drive." And she accepted that to a point, but when we got the car from the shop, the body shop, she said, "I want to drive home." I said, "Margaret, the doctor said that you cannot drive anymore because of the dementia."
In the span of 2 years, Margaret completely changed as a person, and in 2017, she passed away. And you may be asking why I chose to make this on her. That child she's holding, that's me.
They had light again. The light was taken too much. I'm sorry. I know.
Vincent said, I called them, and they were just getting ready to leave the house, and I said, "Trudy and the baby are okay, but we don't know what it is." Vincent said, "It's not that hard."
I made this so when you walk by that Bonnie statue, there's a story behind this. That's more than a statue to me. For me, that was the last part of Margaret that I ever knew.